And we're live, Professor Kotler.
Good day. My name is Erwin Kotler. I'm the International Chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, named in memory of and in tribute to Canada's first honorary citizen, Raoul Wallenberg, who demonstrated how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil, prevail, and thereby transform history. Regrettably, rather than Raoul Wallenberg being treated as a hero he was, whom the United Nations was later to recognize as the greatest humanitarian of the 20th century, he was arrested, became a political prisoner, and disappeared in the Soviet Gulag. And I became a counsel to his family and chaired an international commission on the fate and whereabouts of Raoul Wallenberg in 1990. As it happens, Canada's second honorary citizen is Nelson Mandela, who endured 27 years in a South African prison and who emerged to not only preside over the dismantling of apartheid, but to become the first president of the first ever free and democratic and egalitarian South Africa. And I myself experienced some of apartheid as I was arrested in South Africa in 1981 for doing nothing other than giving a talk on the subject matter being if Sharansky, who was then imprisoned in the former Soviet Union, if Sharansky, why not Mandela? And I had been arrested 2 years earlier with respect to the Soviet Union and my defense of Sharansky there. So I had, for a brief respite, as one of the political prisoners was later to tell me, you were able to experience in a few days what is for us a way of life here in the former Soviet Union, and then of course, apartheid. And so it's not surprising that defending political prisoners, that combating mass atrocities should be a priority on the agenda of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, should be a central pillar of our work in our pursuit of justice. And as it now has emerged, we have been representing the leading political prisoners around the world, from Asia to America, from Africa to the Middle East and Europe. We will be sharing with you today a profile of these political prisoners who effectively embody the struggle for human rights in our day, where the persecution and prosecution of these human rights heroes is an assault on human rights, where their pain and plight is a looking glass, not only into that persecution and prosecution, but in fact to our individual and collective responsibilities to act on their behalf. And that is why we have held this annual Political Prisoner Day on UN Human Rights Day, where we celebrate the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, its commitment to the inherent dignity of every human being, to the equal dignity of all human beings, that which is under assault and which these political prisoners so heroically represent. I regret that Jared Genzer, our American co-chair, cannot be with us as we are speaking. He is returning from a trip to Asia precisely for being involved in political prisoners. I will share some of his remarks with you. And the format will be that we will hear first from Professor Payam Akhavan, the Canadian co-chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, one of the leading scholars and human rights advocates globally, who will address the situation of human rights in Iran and the pain and plight of Nasrin Sotoudeh, the iconic woman human rights political prisoner in Iran. I will then follow with a profile, brief profiles of 4 political prisoners whom we represent, and then we will conclude with a fireside chat between Yona Diamond, our international legal counsel on the Raoul Wallenberg Center, and Rehan Assad, who is herself not only a senior fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Center, but herself a fellow at Yale Law School, my old alma mater, and she will provide a looking glass on the situation with respect to China and atrocity crimes there. So let me turn it now over to a video from Professor Payam Akhavan.
I don't think we can hear.
In a heartbreaking, I miss you, my dearest. How does a mother explain to her small children that she has been sentenced to 38 years in prison simply for defending the rights of women and girls to equality? Yet Nasrin Sotoudeh, Iranian lawyer and human rights champion, had to do exactly that in a heartbreaking letter to her son Nima and daughter Mehraveh. She had to explain to them why they were robbed of the warm embrace of their mother, why they had to go to prison to see her smiling face, to hear her words of love and encouragement. How do I tell you where I am, she wrote, when you are so innocent and too young to comprehend the true meaning of words such as prison, arrest, sentence, trial, and injustice. Sadly, Nasrin is but one of numerous political prisoners languishing in Iran's torture chambers for having dared to speak truth to power. Around the world, there are thousands upon thousands of political prisoners like her, whose only crime is demanding an end to tyranny. Their courage teaches us that the struggle for justice is full of pain and sacrifice. We all have a basic choice in life: to confront injustice or to turn our back and become a bystander. The Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg faced this stark choice during the Holocaust. He risked his life to save thousands of Hungarian Jews from the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps. Today, the descendants of these survivors are scattered throughout the world. They would have never existed were it not for Wallenberg making the right choice. Or perhaps it can be said that the power of empathy left him with no choice, because helping the victims was the only path for being a true human being. Today, the dedicated staff of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights continue that struggle for justice. An exceptionally talented team, they have advocated for numerous political prisoners around the world whose only hope is not to be forgotten by the world. The center is a reminder of the responsibility that we have as Canadians to contribute our share to spreading the ideals of freedom and democracy that we too often take for granted. I'm proud to be the Canadian co-chair of the Wallenberg Center, and on this Human Rights Day, I wish to recognize its invaluable work in giving hope to those who have sacrificed everything to make the world a better place. As Nasrin wrote to her children, I believe that the pain we have had to endure is not in vain. Justice arrives exactly at the time when most have given up hope. The surest path to tyranny is indifference to the suffering of others. And the surest path to justice is empathy and engagement. On this day, the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, in the ashes of the Second World War, we should reflect on the progress made while focusing on the work ahead, confident that each and every one of us has a role to play and that our actions can indeed make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Payam. You have ensured in your scholarship and in your advocacy that human rights is not being forgotten, that the pain and plight of political prisoners in Iran and elsewhere is being acted upon to secure the justice of which Nasreen Sotoudeh spoke and which you have been protecting so compellingly all these years. May I now share with you a snapshot of 4 political prisoners that the Raoul Wallenberg Center represents, and who, as I said, reflect and represent the globality of our involvement in these cases and causes. The first is the Swedish Eritrean political prisoner, Dwight Isaacs, himself, as I mentioned, a dual national, who is the longest imprisoned journalist in the world, who was arbitrarily arrested and detained in the shadow of 9/11 some 20 years ago, tortured in detention, held virtually incommunicado these last 20 years, denied any access to family or to consular representation, denied any access to a lawyer or to any representation before an independent tribunal, and being held by the repressive regime in Eritrea, which is ranked 180 out of 180 countries in the World Press Index. And so his case and cause also illustrates the assault on media freedom, the assault on the safety and security of journalists, and regrettably, the impunity that has accompanied it, and where the indifference and inaction by the international community only incentivizes such impunity. And there is clear action that can be taken in the case and cause of Dwight Isaac, recommended, among other things, by a consortium of international human rights NGOs, international human rights media groups, parliamentarians, and the like, calling for, among other things, the impositions of coordinated Magnitsky sanctions. It is astonishing that the leadership of Eritrea has yet to be targeted for Magnitsky sanctions. 2, to invoke the Declaration on Arbitrary Detention, led by Canada in February 2021, which now has over 67 signatories, and which is directly for the purpose of combating hostage diplomacy and the imprisonment of dual nationals such as Dwight Isaac. The third action that can be taken here is to mobilize the Media Freedom Coalition that was established 2.5 years ago by Canada and the United Kingdom when they established the World Press Freedom Forum. Number 4, to act upon the urgent calls, those are their words, by the UN special procedures for the release of Dwight Isaac, similar to the finding and conclusions of the UN Commission of Inquiry with respect to human rights in Eritrea, which confirmed what others have been holding and proclaiming, that in effect, Dwight Isaac is a forcibly disappeared person. His continuing detention amounts to a continuing crime against humanity. I spoke of this in my testimony days ago before the Swedish Parliament, and I trust that Sweden will undertake as well the necessary leadership with the community of democracies on behalf of Dwight Isaac's case and cause. The second political prisoner whose case I wish to highlight is that of Alexei Pichugin, who is the longest serving political prisoner in the former Soviet Union, now Russia, where Alexei Pichugin was himself the victim not only of false and trumped up charges, not only the victim of false evidence adduced, but where the Russia continues to breach its own legal system, its own international undertakings, and those of the European Court of Human Rights, which is called also for Alexei Pichugin's release, reminding us of the cover story just last week in The Economist with respect to Putin's repression in Russia, and where the number of political prisoners in Russia has increased 8-fold over the last 5 years alone, and where Alexei Pichugin is the, as I mentioned, the longest imprisoned political prisoner, serving as a looking glass into Putin's repression. The third political prisoner whom we have been engaged in his case and cause now for close to 10 years is that of Raif Badawi, the imprisoned Saudi blogger who is now completing his 10th year of imprisonment in Saudi Arabia for saying 10 years ago what the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has himself been saying for the last 5 years, calling for a more open Saudi Arabia, a more moderate Islam. And indeed, we made those representations in a petition directly to Mohammed bin Salman, calling for his release, a release anchored in Saudi Arabian law, in Islamic law. And as he moves to the end of his term in February 2022, Raif Badawi is scheduled to be released. We are calling upon Saudi Arabia to allow him to not only be released from prison, but to be able to be reunited with his wife and 3 children here in Canada, here in Sherbrooke, Quebec, where they are citizens and where they have been suffering, awaiting the reunification with their father, from whom they have been forcibly separated all these years. So we trust that Saudi Arabia will honor its obligations under its own law, under its international treaty obligations, and not only free Raif Badawi at the conclusion of his sentence, but permit him, as I said, to be reunited with his family here in Canada and put an end to this human suffering that he has been the victim of all these years. The next and final political prisoner whom I wish to mention is Judge Maria Lourdes Afiuni of Venezuela. Here too, we have been engaged in representation on her behalf. She was initially arbitrarily detained, tortured in prison, such horrific torture that it came to be known as the Afiuni effect. In other words, after Judge Maria Lourdes Afiuni was imprisoned for doing nothing other but discharging her responsibilities as a judge, she was targeted for some of the most horrific torture imagined in Maduro's prisons. And then it was held out to other judges and other members of the legal profession that were they to uphold, in effect, the principles of the independence of the judiciary, the rule of law, and the like, they would suffer the same fate as Judge Afuni in what came to be known as the intimidating Afuni effect. And so her case is a looking glass into the assault on the rule of law in Venezuela, into the assault on the independence of the judiciary, into the assault of human rights that Venezuela, among other things, as a state party to the International Criminal Court, has sworn to uphold. And we are pleased that the special investigator for the International Criminal Court has now decided to open an investigation into Venezuelan crimes against humanity since 2014, and where the case of Judge Maria Lourdes Afuni is a looking glass, as she was recently sentenced yet again on a trumped-up charge of spiritual corruption to another 5 years in prison. And here too, the international community must be mobilized, not only on her behalf, but on behalf of the causes for human rights that she represents, which engage us all. I will now turn this over to a fireside chat between Yona Diamond, legal advisor at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, who has himself been engaged in undertaking legal initiatives on behalf of the political prisoners whose cases and causes I've been sharing with you. And he will be engaged in a fireside chat with Rehan Asper, who's herself a hero of human rights, who has just been addressing the Summit on Democracy in the United States, who is a senior fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, as she is a fellow at Yale Law School, my old alma mater. And so I'm delighted now to turn the balance of this program over into a conversation between Yona and Rehan on the issues of the day, including mass atrocity crimes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kotler, for framing our conversation and the day, and for the powerful calls to action that always motivate us to continue our work, and the audience as well to continue this work. And we also heard from our co-chair, Payam Akhavan, another inspiration of ours. Were it not for Payam, actually, and his deep empathetic lawyering, Rehan and I would not have met, and she wouldn't have been introduced to the Raoul Wallenberg Center in early 2020, last year. When we first heard about the forcible disappearance of Rehan's brother, Ektar, the compassionate and brilliant brother that he is, a model citizen, renowned Uyghur tech entrepreneur, philanthropist, and an alumnus of the prestigious State Department program, the International Visitor Leadership Program. Rehan has led, and I've kind of been privileged to watch this in real time, an international movement to free her brother and all Uyghurs cruelly held in concentration camps. And we partnered with Rehan. Well, to give Rehan a little bit more of an introduction, I always think she doesn't need an introduction, but of course, for those who don't know, she's a human rights attorney. She's a graduate of Harvard Law School, and she's now a Yale World Fellow. And she's a senior fellow both at our center, as Prof mentioned, as Professor Kotler mentioned, and at the Atlantic Council, amongst countless achievements. And so we've partnered with Rehan in her search for justice and to return Ektar home. We've appealed to and to seek justice for the mass atrocities against the Uyghurs at large. We've appealed to the UN, governments, students, parliamentarians, and the international community. It's because of you, Rehan, that I personally and the center have become so deeply involved in this cause. And while Ekpar is not a political prisoner, he is a victim of the same sort of repression we're discussing, and he is, as the event title implies, a looking glass into a broader mass atrocity against the Uyghurs. And I'm not sure I know anyone as effective as you, Rayhan, in getting your message across with such a global impact. And I think in part, due to the background I was discussing, but also your very international background. You're from Urumqi. You studied and worked in Wuhan, across different cities in China, in Canada, Turkey, and the US. So you have a real international background. And
Thank you.
yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about your brother, Ekpar, just to start us off?
Yeah, and thank you so much for these generous words, Professor Kotler. I am immensely grateful for your mentorship and friendship of Yona Diamond. I think, to kick off, you attributed so much of success to me, but I think, Free Akbar started I want to free my brother to become sort of movement. I think none of this would have been successful without the support of international community, especially dedicated human rights advocates such as yourself. I think often when we talk about, on this Human Rights Day, we're talking about political prisoners, but also we need to acknowledge victims of atrocity crime, such as my brother. And I think there are two distinctions between political prisoners versus victims of concentration camps or atrocity crimes. And in my brother's case, we grew up in Urumqi, in Xinjiang, and he's I think our family is the embodiment in some ways of this period in which China was opening up itself to the rest of the world and allowed, in some ways, like diversity to exist or even to some extent survive. Like that's why the Chinese government allowed him to come onto the State Department's program. But I think in many ways, like what my brother truly believed is that working within the system, because at the end of the day, like you are part of this country, you are a citizen of that country. And he created the social media platform, but also it provided opportunities for many young and upcoming artists, musicians, entrepreneurs like himself, and writers too. And people were able to share their talent on social media with the rest of the world. And when oftentimes we know this, even within the human rights field, there's always some gatekeepers. And I think it just was able to break that entrance to barrier to the entrance, and these people, their career flourished as a result of this open platform. So that's what my brother did. But at the same time, one thing I think I often don't talk about is that, at this time, and I do want to emphasize that China was acknowledging that, there got to be some sort of transparency within the government too. And, in order to be, to channel some of the good governance model in other countries, they were responding to public pressure, for example. And I remember my brother created this grievances system where the platform itself, so citizens can share their complaint or sort, which all of that was allowed. And actually it created such a great way for the government to communicate with their own constituents or citizens or local citizens. And that's why I think, at the time when there was a tension was rising in Xinjiang between ethnic communities, in some ways it contributed to this harmonious society that, the local government aspired to create in Xinjiang. So that was the crux of the platform, or what he tried to do. Yeah. But at his core, he's a philanthropist. Because of a very tragic family story, he was very much dedicated to helping kids with disabilities. Often when, as advocates, I am his advocate, I'm his voice. So I always struggle, like, which aspect of his life, like he wants to be amplified. And I think this aspect, that he was dedicated to helping people, survivors of sexual violence, elderly. So he did a lot of events with the government together to bring about, positive change, helping people, especially kids, and providing opportunities for them. So I think that is who he is. So yeah.
Wow. And he's how old? He's 35 now?
Yeah.
35.
Yeah, 34, 35. Yeah.
And for the platform known as Bagdash,
Mhm.
he received praise from like the media,
Yeah.
the government, and was that part of the reason why he was invited on the State Department leadership?
Absolutely. I think, and this is during President Obama's administration. So my brother was featured in many Chinese state-owned media outlets, including Technology and The Future. So it's a magazine, and in which they describe him as a bright star in the tech world.
Mhm.
And then there was like some Chinese state-owned media where he did this wonderful initiative. It was in celebration of Xinjiang's 60 years anniversary, since it became part of like the founding of People's Republic of China. So what he did is like, we love Xinjiang. The people of Xinjiang, we love Xinjiang. So he invited people from all walks of life, different ethnic communities, Han, Uyghurs, Kazakh, all alike, to share best wishes for the future of Xinjiang. So as a result of this, the state-owned media interviewed him and called him a positive force for humanity. And that was only a few months before his enforced disappearance took place. So that was late 2015, and 2016 spring, he came to the US as part of the State Department's International Visitors Leadership Program. And as you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, President Obama and Obama administration try to reach out to broader, diverse community to strengthen US-China relationship. So he was selected for this program along with Han, some of the brightest and finest of the Han Society. And as a group, they formed such a strong bond during their 3 weeks trip to almost like a month's trip to the US, because you're like only like 8, 9 people. And then I think most people in that group were women. So my brother would just help them to carry their luggage, really looking after them. And they had this like wonderful dream of like going back to China and create a documentary and to showcase that, there could be this peace and ethnic harmony and unity in China. But little did we know that a nightmare was about to ensue. So within weeks, and in fact, it's like, to be exact, on April 7th of 2016, he disappeared. And I think his trip to the US coincided at a time when the Chinese government decided to crack down on or waging a war against Uyghur as a race.
Yeah, and a lot of us know about the astonishing numbers of Uyghurs held in concentration camps. And it sounds like Ekpar really embodied someone who was advancing the so-called goals of the Chinese government in Xinjiang to try and create that kind of ethnic unity and bridge building that you're discussing. So, I guess not only he's such a tragic case and one of the many victims, but it is also just an example of how China is completely going against its own self-interest and claimed self-interest.
Yeah, and President Xi Jinping and Chinese leaders now have been rolling out this like one Chinese dream, right? Like, if China wants to present like Chinese dream, like it's such a proud thing to be Chinese, then you need to represent a diverse country, a country in which ethnic communities can thrive as much as the majority. And that should be a broader Chinese dream. And, my brother has always said, like, I'm a proud Zhongguoren, which means like I'm a proud Chinese. And I think so many Uyghurs do feel that, and that national pride up until like this 2016 has changed. the entire perception of Uyghurs that they don't feel like they belong to this country because the country was not treating them like their citizen, right? So exactly as you said, I think it was supposed to advance China's interest on the international stage to present, like an Uyghur person can represent China on this kind of like big trip. Like, China doesn't just handpick people, but also allow Uyghurs to become this part of Greater China that is so diverse and inclusive. But I think it hurts China's interests, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's unfathomable that this would happen to Ekpai. Were there moments when you felt that advocacy was working for improving his conditions, let's say?
It's I think so. And just to give a bit of background, like for 4 years I was silent, right? Like I was silent. I tried to use any forms of private advocacy to secure his release, and none of that worked. Like, I mean, I tried to reach out to some of my professors from Wuhan, people I know, people I helped in the past, including the business community. Because, formerly I was working at a Wall Street law firm and I was representing Chinese companies. So I tried to reach out to some of these clients and ask them help. And often the response that I got was, well, Xinjiang is very sensitive. Maybe if this is took place in other parts of China, there's things we could have done. But with Xinjiang, it's very much like hands-off approach. Like people are afraid. So I think like, it led to nowhere, like, this kind of private advocacy. And I also reached out to the State Department and asked them. But ultimately, I think, in terms of advocacy, not only me appealing to the State Department, but also you need to push them through like public pressure too, right? And I think that's how the beauty of democracy is that we can hold our government accountable through public pressure and swaying the public opinion towards your cause. And I think that's what I did. And public advocacy, I would like to believe that it works in one way, because after relentless a-year advocacy, for the first time, the Chinese government was forced to showcase my brother in some sort of like proof of life video. I mean, obviously, like, in that video, he looked like gaunt, he looked like a shadow of his former self. And then it didn't help me to know that, like, he's in a solitary confinement. He has been in solitary confinement since January 2019. So it almost feels like, well, apparently it doesn't work. But I still believe that Chinese government responds to public criticism. And there are good people within the Chinese government. And as long as, like, there is a better communication, and hopefully I could reach out to those moderate voices who can see like what they're doing in Xinjiang is absolutely inhumane. So that has been my goal, to really believe in the conscience of good people within the government. And I'm pretty sure like there are good people.
And I know your message has reached some people that you're describing, or in mainland China. What kind of responses have you received?
I have received heartening messages from general public, especially when I hosted like clubhouse discussions. And to be fair, like the people who tuned in my message are elites, right? Like the moderate, they're liberal, they understand how to the concept of democracy, and they truly believe that no one should be persecuted because of their race. But I also would like to think that these elites could be the future of China. And now they heard my story, and hopefully in the next few years, when they become leaders in their own right, then they can bring about change. But also from the general public, sometimes my Twitter inbox is open and I receive heartening messages. But including at Yale, where I'm a fellow, I was able to host these like private discussions, and Chinese students, Chinese scholars, they have been my great source of information and wisdom in so many ways. They offer me feedback, they offer me insight as to what they think or what the Chinese government think. Because you need to, when it comes to advocacy, I think you need to approach it from a very holistic angle, right? No, that's something that I truly believe in. So, so I appreciate that. And I think, ultimately, we need to have confidence and faith in people that Chinese people are also like, compassionate, kind human beings who care about what's happening to their fellow citizens.
Yeah. And I know even in your Democracy Summit speech, you appealed to some of those values.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I appeal to this, traditional Chinese values. I emphasize that. And, one of the famous quote that I like is peaceful family will prosper. So what they're doing to my family and just like shattering this beautiful family unity that we have, our love for each other. So that is the message that I try to emphasize and also like offer a hope for the future that I would love to see China as a prosperous democracy.
yeah, and it was so powerful to watch that speech. Just actually, maybe I'll quote a little bit, just because I found this part so powerful. You said, the destruction of an entire community desecrates our collective humanity. From Uyghur to Oromo to Yazidi to Rohingya to Tigray, we're all victims. So what kind of world we want to aspire towards and create? Is it a world where the leaders prioritize national interest and choose silence in the face of injustice? We want to live in a world where inequality triumphs over equality, exclusion over unity, bigotry over empathy. And today you invited everyone to choose a different world, a world in which no one is persecuted because of their race, sexual orientation, identity, and politics. And the world pledged to choose after the Holocaust when we said never again. So very, very powerful words. I just wanted to quote you, and because on a day like today, Human Rights Day, when we're commemorating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, your broader message is so powerful. And so I want to just quickly ask about what it's like to receive support from other advocates from other countries who are also seeking the release of their loved ones. Have they given you any insight, or particularly those who have lost loved ones in China? How has that support helped?
Yeah, so whether somebody is a victim of concentration camps or atrocity crime or political prisoner, the underlying conditions are the same. These are unjustly detained people. So when I look at this, I think, often when I look at somebody forcibly disappear, unjustly detained, the first thing I think about not only the person who's detained, but also the family members, because I understand the pain and the constant struggle in the fight and in the pursuit of justice and freedom for their loved ones. So, because having that intimate understanding of that pain and struggle, I think what I can do is offer that compassion towards other people who are, the loved ones or family members of those detained in every corner of the world, because I understand their pain. So this is why it was very important for me to amplify the other victims, whether Syrians, Oromo, Rohingya, everybody. And I think that kind of compassion, because at the end of the day, when it comes to compassion, there should not be borders, like we are part of this global world, we're citizens of the world. And, what happens to a Tigrayan should concern me as much as what happens to the Uyghur people. And that's the kind of human rights framework that I would like to operate in, and especially for the world leaders too. I think oftentimes, sometimes countries choose a political prisoner or a cause based on their national interest. And we need to reject that. We need to advocate on a matter of principle. We need to be truly human rights advocates. We need to set aside our national interests and be true champion for human rights.
I think this is something we both kind of worry about and think about. So I wanted to ask you, do you ever worry about how standing up for human rights in China can sometimes become a partisan issue or exploited for opportunism, particularly in today's hyper-polarized US. I know it's kind of something that I'm also like struggling with, like, how can you, is there a point when sometimes support can affect cause? I don't know if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So the thing, like, I mean, obviously, like, it's been quite an interesting, like you look at Washington, D.C., like, now, like I from New Haven, like I was able to see Washington, D.C. from a different lens right now. And that gave me also about a clarity, if anything. I mean, there are members of Congress, some may view them as though more like hawkish, China hawkish. And then there are other people who are also advocating that when it comes to mass atrocities or crimes against humanity, it doesn't matter which country is perpetrating that crime itself, we must stand up. So, and just because somebody like, has a maybe sort of like a negative view, or more like, maybe some might say like principled stance, because it's not like, they have been standing up for human rights when it happened to Uyghurs, could be like, historical. There's a track record of human rights abuse. Some may argue that. And just looking at China's past history, and should that person be qualified as a China hawk or a principled advocate who has this proven records of standing up for human rights freedom? So, so I believe that, when it comes to China, we do see more like alignment in Washington, rather like, Democrats or Republicans. I think that, when it comes to the special Uyghur issue, we're talking about in 21st century, a country is locking up its people in concentration camps, forced labor factories, and prisons. And this issue should not be politicized and should not be pursued because of there is a national interest, or the US feels insecure because now the Chinese government is so powerful, and from a rising China, now we have a full spectrum competitor, not because of that, but purely because of human rights concerns. So I would like to see it that, and if that is not the case, I'm more than happy to call out the US government. And that's part of like, being an advocate about, being principled.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it, especially today. That should really be the goal of today, to bring it back to human rights and as our universal shared common goal of pursuing. And we know this week that the Uyghur tribunal issued an independent judgment, People's Tribunal, on that, finding that, People's Republic of China is responsible for genocide, crimes against humanity, and torture. How do you think, will this advance the cause further? Is this progress?
I think the Chinese government might argue this is not an independent tribunal because it was commissioned by an organization that they deem as a separatist organization. But I think at the end of the day, I do believe it's an independent tribunal. I mean, Sir Jeffrey Nice has a great reputation, and I think the team that he assembled together asked really hard questions. They were not showing like any sort of favoritism. Like, in fact, if anything, they were pushing back. And I tuned in some of the sessions, including the one where you were testifying as an expert, and I was truly moved. Just, how sharp your argument and John Packer, and truly capturing like, what's happening right now meets the UN definition of genocide. So I think it was independent tribunal, like came out with their independent findings. And that is something that, should be respected or tuned into at least. I think there are two ways to respond to criticism. One is knee-jerk response, completely dismiss the criticism and continue that wrong path. Or another is like, take a step back, pause for a second and reflect and be able to respond more positively. And I hope or I advocate China would take the latter approach and say, that, and this has been the case when survivors came about and shared their stories, there has been some sort of attack on their character. And I don't think that's the right approach. Regardless, you may disagree with the position they are taking, but you need to listen. I think being able to listen is in itself, I think, a true trait. I mean, look at the Supreme Court justices here, they all listen, and, government officials and countries like China, who tries to be this world leader, should listen to international opinion and act like a global actor. And China can be, I think, a good actor if they want to. And that's what we should be inviting. That's how I feel.
Yeah. And I'm just cautious of time, but yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And I felt also that the panel did a really good job of trying to of retaining independence and skepticism, and poring over thousands, tens of thousands of documents of evidence. So and it's not just the Uyghur Tribunal. Of course, you and I have written about this in the past, and victims have long been saying this, and human rights organizations agree on the findings, and to one extent or another, and have additional evidence. So it's all part of this movement.
Can I just add one more thing? One thing that I really liked, and I had to look at the findings in detail tomorrow. But one thing I really liked, I think the tribunal also took some of the same approach that I've been taking, which is to emphasize, China as a country cares a lot about its reputation, right? They call it face, right? If somebody who knows China, it cares a lot about its face, which is reputation. Means that's a Chinese term for it. And how locking up people in the concentration camps and being accused of genocide would help their reputation. It was almost like the tribunal also sought to appeal to the Chinese government in that language, or at least that's how I interpreted it, by being able to still trying to find that commonalities in which they can operate. And I commend this.
Right.
Because some of the Uyghur groups, they just, they believe that there has to be this singular opinion among the Uyghur group and Uyghur people. I just think that's a very wrong approach. You need to allow diversity of opinion, views, and push back. That's how you yourself achieve, democracy. You cannot argue that it has to be one way or the other.
And as Payam noted, while it's important to keep our focus on the work ahead, it's also important to reflect on progress and to think about how we can continue this pressure to affect real change. And with the growing international diplomatic boycott of the Olympics, the WTA suspending tennis tournaments in China recently, the tribunal judgment, there's a lot of we're seeing a lot of movement. Would you see this as progress? And what do you think will help or will actually pressure China to reverse course?
Well, I think these are, good progresses in some ways, that it recognized the suffering of Uyghur people, and it was a policy response or action response to what has happened over the past 5 years and beyond. But at the same time, I still think that, we need to be careful as not to see this some sort of a zero-sum game. I don't like to see as, China is evil. I just don't think that's true. And also, I know there has been this broader effort of separating Chinese Communist Party or China. While I think it is well-intentioned, in my view, I think Chinese people also support the Chinese Communist Party. You may believe that they don't have standing, but Chinese people believe that they do. It's a legitimate government in their eyes. So I think while respecting the Chinese Communist Party stand, in my view, I think then there has to be this international condemnation and criticism as to its policies, especially these racist policies in Xinjiang. Also, like, you know, in Hong Kong, right? Some of the egregious rights violations, or in Tibet or elsewhere. Or like, you know, in terms of this tennis star, Peng Shuai, right? Like, I mean, all she did was expose something deeply painful that has happened to her. And we still don't know her whereabouts, whether she's safe or not. So I think, and I think most importantly, we also need to look a bit inward. Look at the International Olympic Committee. We really need to criticize them. Like, not only they were complicit, in fact, they facilitated this discussion between Peng Shuai, like, and the officials that actually been part of this, you know, sexual abuse against her. How would a person feel comfortable facing their tormentor, right, or perpetrator? And that's why International Olympic Committee must be condemned. I think we need to hold our own institutions, American corporations who are sponsoring the game, like, you know, we need to look a bit inwardly and hold them accountable.
I just want to ask one more thing. If we might have time for Q&A. When you say that a lot of people in China support the party, do you know to what extent they know about what's going on in Xinjiang?
I would love to believe that they don't, but I think the elites do know. What I do worry is that they haven't been given full information, or in some ways they support it. They support it because they think that they really bought into this whole idea of, like, you know, security at all costs. In order to maintain China's global standing, these are the measures that needed. It's justified. And that for me is too scary. I hope that's not the case, but I've been discussing with Chinese scholars, Chinese Americans, and they seem to have this deep-seated fear that vast majority of Chinese people actually supports its policies in Xinjiang. And that's a very deep concern for me. I wish I have full information to be absolutely correct to say it's either or. But I think one thing we need to acknowledge is that Chinese people are happy. You know, one may disagree with me on this, but China did lift people out of poverty. And that's why, like, you know, people look back, 10 years ago, where my life was versus where it is now. And then they would say, like, you know, we're living much more prosperous, like in terms of economic prosperity. China did bring this economic prosperity. So they're solely focused on this materialistic pursuit of life and just saying, like, you know, I'm happy. That's why they are, they don't condemn the government. They're just happy the system as it is, except we need to really push back to say, well, to which the majority, yes, China did bring economic prosperity, but for the minority, the opposite is true. If anything, we've seen land dispossession of the Uyghurs, right? Like, you know, unemployment rates in the Uyghur region. So the majority cannot justify when it's like sort of like the only community that is actually benefiting from the economic prosperity that China has gained over the years, when ethnic communities are locked up in the camps. So I think it's just a very complex China. It's very hard for people to understand. If you look at Beijing, it's, you know, look at the high-speed trains. It's impossible and inconceivable, unfathomable for a person to think that, you know, 4 hours flight in Xinjiang, that people are locked up in dark corners of the region. It's impossible. So it creates this disconnect. You know, you immediately like, well, look, everything looks wonderful. Or sometimes even if you go to Urumqi, it's so seductive. It's the capital city. Like, you look at Grand Bazaar, some of the sort of, like, you know, flagship part of the city, and it's like, oh, look, everything looks normal. But it's not. You need to look, and especially the Chinese government has removed some of the visible signs of repression. And I think Associated Press report about this. But I think we need to look beyond that, right? Like, if we can't just have a few days tourism trips out to some country and presume you know everything about that country.
Yeah. I think this is why it's so important to center the victims, like you always try and do. And I mean, in your Democracy Summit speech, you also mentioned that, yeah, you asked everyone to take up a cause and take up a family's case, because there are so many families that need their stories to be shared. And I mean, it also sounds like this economic influence in a way is impacting China domestically and also internationally in some ways. But at least in the international community, perhaps we can have more of an impact in demonstrating to the world what's happening in Xinjiang, and hopefully that now with all this evidence and well-known public documentation of everything, you know, that you know, people won't put their monies over human life and human rights. Do you have what's next? What's next for you, just as an advocate? What do you have planned?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, you know, first of all, I really hope like the European Union and as well as like many of the emerging democracies took a stance on this issue. Because when we do, actually, like, you know, I think we would live peacefully with China too. Like, you know, I think one thing we need to acknowledge, international community welcome China to this world. So let's make sure, like, you know, this system where we welcome China and embrace China operates as such, right? Like, not one country is changing the world order, and I would reject that. And I think it advances China's interest as well, right? Like, so that's the kind of response that I wish to see, because then otherwise it would become this, oh, US-China global power competition. It's framed as such, and it does so much disservice to the legitimate suffering of the Uyghur people. So I really hope the European Union and many emerging democracies, including countries in the Middle East, Central Asia, start to speak out. Because, you know, if you really care about China as a country, and if you deem China as an ally, a strategic partner, then wouldn't you want to help them when they're making mistakes and invite them to be better? You know, I mean, I think good friends speak truth to each other, right? Like, that's what I would like to see. And in terms of me, I mean, you know, I mean, I had really started out this campaign out of this genuine love for my brother, and you know, he doesn't deserve his talent, wisdom, and kindness to be wasted in these camps. So I think his world, his everything he represents, need to be shared with the world. And I think he's also, like, you know, he advanced China's interests at the world stage, and he would only help China, and he could be that bridge builder. And I think, you know, the Chinese government should also like free him. That's my number one goal. I think my entire advocacy is sort of oriented around that. But I also am deeply aware that if he wasn't a Uyghur, then he wouldn't be detained. So that's became part of the discussion, right? Like, I end up fighting for everybody, because this is not just happening to my brother. This is happening to my people too. No, so I think I would love to see my brother. I would love to greet him here at Yale, and, you know, hopefully pick up other causes. Because once, like, you know, I free my brother, I would love to help with the Syrian community, a community that I've worked with over the past few years. And I would love to help the Tigrayans and other atrocity crimes. So yeah.
Well, your optimism is contagious, and I hope I'm here for that reunion when you have
Thank
it,
you.
whether it's at Yale or wherever you are next. And I suppose we can see if there are questions. I'll check with the administrator, my colleague Jeremy. Oh, someone has a question for Professor Kotler. and a question as to who one can contact in the U.S. Senate. So if Professor Kotler would like to take this, so when will Canada impose Magnitsky sanctions against the corrupt leaders who are responsible for major human rights violations in China, Venezuela, Myanmar, and elsewhere? Professor, are you able to?
Yes. So thanks for that question. The whole issue of Magnitsky sanctions is crucial with respect to securing justice for the victims and accountability for the human rights violators. Canada has imposed Magnitsky sanctions on a range of human rights violators in Venezuela et al. But Magnitsky sanctions have to both be broadened in terms of the violator, and again, Magnitsky sanctions are imposed on human rights violators, not on specific countries. These are individualized sanctions, but we need to expand and enhance those human rights violators that are to be targeted for Magnitsky sanctions. For example, with respect to Venezuela, we have imposed a good number of sanctions, but with respect to Iran, hardly any sanctions at all. So there's been a discrepancy with respect to the imposition of Magnitsky sanctions, and I'm hoping that this will now be revisited by the Canadian government. This too is also the responsibility of civil society groups to make submissions with respect to the imposition of Magnitsky sanctions, and the government also to both themselves initiate and then impose such Magnitsky sanctions. But its purpose now has been enhanced by the adoption recently of the European Union of a Magnitsky sanctions framework. And as we are meeting Australia about to be adopting a Magnitsky sanctions framework. So we have, in fact, expanded dramatically the orbit of countries who can impose Magnitsky sanctions from what was the US, Canada, and the UK to now include the European Union, Australia, et al. So there now is a capacity for coordinated sanctions, and I trust that the government, in concert with the community of democracies, will act in that regard.
Thank you, Professor Kotler. And I think we are now running out of time. So I just want to thank you, Rehan, so much for sitting down with us. I thank you, Professor Kotler, for setting the stage and always, being our leader and inspiration. And thank you, Payam, for your opening remarks. And again, Rehan, really, it's always I always learn so much from you, and as an advocate and as someone who really embodies the ideals of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was translated into over 500 languages, but is not always fulfilled. But you are really, living proof that these are not only aspirations, but this can be done, and this is possible. So thank you so much. And
thank you. And feelings are mutual. And I say the same thing to Professor Kotler. You have been such a great mentor and role model for all of us, and Payam too. I really hope he knows how much admiration that I have, and mutually we both have this for him and so many people out there. So yeah, let's keep up the good fight, and especially strengthen our friendship. And yeah.
Amen. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing to work together in common cause, inspired by these great human rights defenders that we have been, whose cases and causes that we've been addressing this morning. And you, Yona and Rehan, thank you really for this very engaging and inspiring conversation. Look forward to more of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Professor.
Have a wonderful day.